Hey, I'm Shane. Today I'm going to be talking about the Sony 200-600 f5.6-6.3. This lens was announced a little bit over a year ago for Sony full-frame cameras and filled out the last major hole in the Sony lens lineup, and that is a super telephoto lens. In this video, I'm going to do a very thorough review of it. So this video is all about the Sony 200-600mm f5.6-6.3 G optically stabilized lens. This lens I've been using for about 6 months now and have had a blast using it. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about essentially all the pros and cons of the lens, talking about the build quality, image quality, autofocusing, and also comparing it to the limited other options available for Sony full-frame cameras at this time. So before I get into the real meaty part of the review, I want to talk briefly about what the 200-600mm focal length is all about, because it's quite a ridiculous kind of zoom. If you used to shoot on a DSLR, you might be familiar with the options from Sigma and Tamron, the 150-600mm lenses that they made, and this lens is very similar to those lenses. They're mainly designed for wildlife and sports photography and maybe a bit of landscape photography, but functionally at 200mm as the minimum focal distance, this lens basically starts off as a very far zoom and then goes to 600mm, which is a super far zoom. And the idea of this is that it allows you to find a subject and then zoom in on that subject quickly to get focus on them, which makes it super versatile for moving fast objects like in sports and wildlife, but also allows you to be very versatile with the distance you want to zoom in at. The issue is that for any other type of photography, this lens is practically useless to the point of being a burden to take with you, because its super telephoto zoom means that you can't do any real casual photography with it. And I'll talk about this more later in the video, but it's just a very niche lens to have in your kit. With all that said though, I'm going to get into the actual review of the lens now, and I'll start off with the build quality. This lens comes in at a hefty 2.1 kilograms or almost 5 pounds, and comes in at 31.8 centimeters long, or just under a foot, without the lens hood on it. It's a huge lens. Though, with that all said, it's actually relatively compact for a lens of this class. Because of its extreme zoom range and the maximum aperture of f6.3, this lens is just inherently gonna be big no matter which way you design it. One nice feature about the lens though is it's all internally zooming, meaning that when you zoom in and out, the length of the lens doesn't change, as traditionally most lenses that are super telephoto zooms usually do have to have some articulation for the zooming element. This lens contains it all. One pickle that you might run into though is that the front element of this lens is 95mm large, which is super big, and it makes finding circular filters for the front of this lens at a reasonable price very difficult. So it's a difficult lens to even recommend putting a UV filter on just for protection, because it's going to be almost impossible to find one that's cheap. As far as the actual physical materials go, this lens is made of a magnesium alloy and hardened plastic combination, which is very familiar with other lenses in Sony's lineup. And this lens feels very similar to the Sony GM 70-200 or GM 100-400 in its feel, and it just looks almost like a big brother to these lenses. So it fits very well in your kit. And thanks to the aforementioned all internal zooming, the weather sealing is absolutely fantastic on this lens. Unfortunately though, because of the size, it can't fit in my backpack usually, but thankfully due to the weather sealing and just the general ruggedness of this lens can easily take a few hits from a couple branches or whatever dust that the lens does get on it. This lens also has 3 of the same programmable buttons on the side of the lens, as well as all the expected toggles that you'd want, like the manual focus, the focus limiter, and the different stabilization modes, which is making it very easy to control the lens as well as giving you very easy on-the-fly changes. Next up is probably the most important part of the review for most of you, and that is the image quality. And as with most Sony lenses, this lens certainly doesn't disappoint. Overall though, this lens is very, very sharp, and I use it routinely on my Sony a7R III, and it performs very well. In most situations, this lens is going to be more limited by the camera you're using it on than the actual lens itself. With that said though, at 200mm, the lens is its least sharp at a 5.6 there. However, it's only really noticeable that it's not terribly sharp at the edges of the frame when you crop in. And if that's a situation you're finding yourself in, often the image can just be made better by zooming into 600mm. And when the lens is wide open at 600mm, it's significantly sharper. And especially if you drop down to f8 or so, throughout the zoom range is quite a sharp lens, kind of to the point of not being able to tell like any imperfections in the image quality, which is pretty awesome. As with most of my reviews, I don't love getting into the MTF charts and getting really granular with image comparisons, just because I have a hard time telling the differences between the sharpness between images, and I find that it's more useful to just take images with the camera and try and figure out how sharp the lens is and if it's sharp enough for my use case. And with this lens, I find that the image sharpness is more tethered to the application you're using it for in the conditions that you're shooting in, rather than the actual lens being the limiting factor. This is because at 600mm, you'll actually run into atmospheric issues reducing sharpness. And at extreme differences, depending on the humidity, it can end up being a blurry photo no matter if you have the sharpest lens on the planet or not. And also, a huge factor in image sharpness with lenses of this focal length is image stabilization. And thankfully, this lens has pretty stellar image stabilization. It has 3 different modes, 1 being used for just regular use scenarios, 2 is best for panning, and mode 3 is kind of the secret sauce, and it's just for extreme movements of flying birds, planes, or just fast, erratic moving objects. I usually just keep it in mode 1, and I can actually get down to a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second and still get very sharp photos, which was a huge surprise because it kind of breaks all the traditional thinking that you have with regards to shutter speed and focal length, which is pretty sweet. And it's just a testament to the quality of this lens's image stabilization paired with Sony's sensor stabilization. In regards to vignette and distortion, this lens has basically none of either. And turning on the correction in Lightroom really doesn't do anything to the image, which is really nice and makes sense considering the 200 to 600mm focal length that this lens has. However, if you were buying this lens to get macro photos, I'm really sorry to disappoint, but this lens can't. This lens has an abysmal minimum focusing distance of 2.4 meters or 8 feet away, which means that even though it can zoom in to objects really far away, you can't get close to those objects at all. However, what isn't terrible is the bokeh. And this lens has 11 rounded aperture blades. And when you're thinking of a 200 to 600mm lens, I'm sure the first thing that doesn't come to your mind is, how does it render out of focus areas? But I'm happy to say that this lens does it marvelously. And it's very similar to the characteristics that you find in the GM lineup from Sony and the other G lenses from Sony, and that is that it has a very clinical, very smooth out of focus area that doesn't really have much busyness going on, which is my preferred way to have an image. The last topic that I'll touch on is the autofocus system. And in this lens, it's a direct drive supersonic motor, which is found in most of Sony's more premium lenses and performs absolutely marvelously. And similar to the sharpness, this lens is more limited by the camera that you attach it to than the actual lens's autofocusing system itself. It's very snappy, responsive, and most importantly, it's very accurate. The biggest issue that I have with the autofocus system is more inherent to the extreme focal length of this lens than the actual lens itself. And that is that often when you're looking at subjects very far away, you can accidentally focus on subjects in front of your subject rather than the actual subject you want to focus on. This is basically solved by just focus and recomposing, and is more due to the camera's algorithm for finding a subject. However, it is worth noting that this lens does often find objects in the foreground when you're trying to hit the background. If you're using this lens for video, the autofocus system is virtually completely silent and you can't even feel the lens moving, which is pretty impressive considering how big the elements that must be moving inside the lens are. This also makes the act of actually taking photos much easier because when you're getting photos of wildlife or anything, you don't want to have a noisy lens. And it just makes the whole process feel very natural and the lens feels very responsive in your hands, which is ideal. I think by this point in the video, you probably get the point. I'm quite impressed by this lens. It did all the important things right for a lens of this class. It has great build quality, great image quality, and it autofocuses fantastically. But the last big deciding factor is the price. This lens comes in currently at $2,000 or 2,600 Canadian dollars, which is quite an expensive price. However, for a lens of this category, in the build quality that this lens has, in my opinion, it's a fantastic value. And Sony really hit it out of the park with nailing the right price to performance ratio with this lens. However, saying it's a good value kind of means nothing unless you compare to other lenses on the market. And unfortunately, there aren't too many lenses on the market to compare it to. Even from other lens manufacturers, there aren't too many other options yet, just because this lens is kind of the first to hit its market for mirrorless systems, and Canon and Nikon don't have really any comparable lenses out yet for their mirrorless systems. I will start off with the most logical comparison though, and that is the Sony GM 100-400 f4.5 to 5.6 lens for Sony full-frame cameras. This lens is a very similar focal length and comes in at a relatively similar price of $2,500 US or 3,200 Canadian dollars. And it's quite an expensive lens, but that's because it has a very premium quality to it. It's a GM lens and the image quality is just absolutely stellar. The lens overall comes in much smaller than the 200-600 and is much lighter as well. However, when at 400 millimeters, the 100-400 is almost the same length as the 200-600. However, it's still quite a bit lighter. The biggest thing to keep in mind though is that the 100-400 just doesn't have the same reach as a 200-600 millimeter lens. And if you want to get that extra reach out of the 100-400, you have to use a teleconverter, like a 1.4 times teleconverter, which adds a few $100s extra to the price tag of an already expensive lens and reduces the focusing speed as well as the maximum aperture. So it reduces the image quality and just makes the lens harder to use compared to the 200-600 millimeter lens. So at the end of the day, what it comes down to is really the application that you have. So a 100-400 millimeter lens is a much more versatile lens and is really designed for a little bit more of landscape and more everyday photography, whereas a 200-600 millimeter lens is much more clinical and used for the more telephoto stuff and is kind of just better at super telephoto and wildlife photography than the 100-400 is going to be. And if you already have a 70-200 millimeter lens, the 200-600 millimeter lens really extends your reach. And when you don't need that smaller focal length of 70-200, you can just keep it in your bag. However, the combination of those two lenses is super heavy and the 100-400 is much lighter. But if you're looking for a 100-400 millimeter lens, Sigma last week just came out with a 100-400 millimeter lens of their own that comes in at only $1,000 US or 1,300 Canadian, which is an absolutely stellar value. Unfortunately, because there's not too much information out on it yet, I can't comment on the image quality of the lens. However, if it's similar to the older versions of this lens, it's definitely going to be a very compelling option. And if you're looking at the 200-600, I heavily recommend looking at the Sigma 100-400 out for Sony full-frame cameras, because I think that lens is going to be a really compelling option if you don't know what you want to do with your super telephoto photography. The 100-400 is half the price and still a very stellar lens for casual photography. The last two lenses I'll talk about at the same time, and that is the classics I mentioned earlier in the video, the Tamron and Sigma 150-600mm f5.6.3 lenses for Canon FE. These lenses are just classic lenses that can easily be adapted to Sony full-frame cameras with adapters. However, when you're adapting lenses, it has quite a few drawbacks with a relatively reduced autofocus speed, a huge detriment to weather sealing just because adapters never have a really good weather sealing on them, meaning that even though the build quality of those lenses is fantastic, when you slap an adapter between the lens and the camera, it shifts the weight forward, increases 2 points of failure, and also gets rid of all weather sealing, meaning that even though the lenses are great for their native mounts, they're not the best on Sony. So with that said, they come in at a very relatively cheaper price and usually can be found between anywhere of $1,200 US to $1,600, which is a great value. However, with the extra couple hundred for an adapter, it brings it much more similar to Sony's full frame option. And realistically, if you're going to be buying a new lens for a Sony full frame camera, I recommend buying the native 200-600 just because of the increased build quality and autofocus speed and just longevity of the lens. And if you're going to be adapting an old lens that you already have, it certainly makes sense to use your Tamron or Sigma. However, just know that the 200-600 still is going to have a little bit better performance than you have from adapted lenses. Even though the sharpness might be very comparable, all the ease of use and autofocusing will be much easier with the Sony. Okay, so now let's finally get to my final points. I think Sony did a great job with this lens. They designed a very compact, relatively speaking, zoom lens with stellar image quality and excellent autofocus for a very reasonable price point, which is very nice for a Sony lens considering a lot of the GM lenses are super expensive and have great quality, but not necessarily very much accessibility because the price point is so high. Having a G lens like this with stellar image quality, but still a reasonable price point is fantastic. But even though it is so reasonably priced, relatively speaking, it's still a very expensive lens. And for most photographers, this lens might not make sense to purchase. I say this because really, a 200-600mm lens has such a limited use case scenario that unless you know what you want it for, it's not going to be an awesome lens to just have sitting around, and you could almost buy a whole nother camera body for the price of this lens. And that's a very hard justification to purchase. However, for a wildlife photographer, this lens is invaluable. I can't recommend it any higher. It's made wildlife photography way more enjoyable for me just because it's a fun lens to use and it's very easy to use, making me actually have an easier time getting photos with it. For sports photography, I'm really sorry, I don't have any sample images that I can show you because COVID kind of got in the way of me getting photos of sports this summer, unfortunately. However, I can confidently say that this lens will perform really well just because of how fast it focuses, the image quality, and the general zoom range of the lens. So I think it'll do awesome for that. However, I just can't prove it. With that all said, I got this lens just for fun. I'm not a professional wildlife or sports photographer, and I just have a very good time using this lens. Even though I don't have a ton of opportunities to take it out, when I do take it out, it's so fun to use, and it just makes photography exciting again for me. And for that alone, it's completely worth it for myself. Well, that's it for the video. I'm sorry for how long this video took to come out. I've been working on this video for months now, and I had a whole lot of plans for this video. I had a trip to Italy planned and a trip to Florida to test this lens out in more exciting locations. However, because of isolation, I wasn't able to do so. So I just had to kind of explore my own backyard this spring and get photos of wildlife around my area, which was also a great opportunity for me to learn a little bit about where I live and to try out some new things in my hometown. But anyways, thanks for watching the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment below. And if you have any comments on anything that I said, any corrections, I'd love to talk to you. Please leave a comment in the comment section below. If you like the video or enjoyed it and want to see more from me, please consider liking it and also subscribing to my channel. It helps it a ton and helps me to make more videos like this for in the future. Anyways, thanks for watching the video, and I hope you have an awesome day.